And yes, so let me say this meeting is recorded. Well, meeting. This event is recorded because I thought that it would be nice to have a nice archive of all the Summer of Love episodes. Like if it was a material thing, we would put like a pink ribbon on it. It's gonna be just an immaterial series of YouTube videos, but that would also give the chance to more people to follow the debate. So we were saying, drink for Belinda, coffee and croissant for Kate and I.
Yep.
Whatever your beverage, whatever your food and beverage is, welcome. I'm so looking forward for today's talk. And let me thank Belinda Middleweek and Kate Devlin for joining me today. I think this is a very special event of our Summer of Love, not only because of the timing, but this is a morning event for us in the UK, but also because of the topic. In our first episodes of the Summer of Love, we had a couple. We discussed, at one point, we always ended up discussing robot and sex in a way or another. And then now, today, finally, we are gonna hit this topic. No more going around, no more euphemism. Let's talk about it. So, Kate Devlin has. Let me introduce our speakers like properly, although you may know them already. Well, the reason why I invited them is because they're two wonderful women and scholars that have really tackled the question of digital intimacies, care, love, and sex in the digital age, with a special focus on robotics. And Belinda, I really can't wait to hear more about your research. Belinda researched male lovers of sex robots, and I think that today she will tell us something more about it. And Belinda is a senior lecturer at the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia, and her research focuses on the social implication of media technologies, digital intimacy, gender journalism, and transitionary approaches to human-tech interaction. So this is a proper way of saying what I said before. And the work has been published in the journal Sexualities, Feminist Media Studies, also Crime, Media and Culture, and she is the author of Feral Media and the co-author of Real Sex Films, A New Intimacy and Risk in Cinema. So you see, we have a real expert of digital intimacies and sexualities, etc. And Kate, well, Kate is the author of Turned On Science, Sex and Robots, was one of the best books on the topic, for sure the best that I read. And also it really, when you start reading it, after 4 lines, it totally gets you. Like you're like, yes, let's go for it. So it is a very engaging academic book, and this is a rarity, at least in my experience. And also, Kate is someone that is a truly interdisciplinary background, because she's a computer scholar, like one of these people that I really take in mind that generally I don't understand. And also she's a proper cultural scholar. She's a great writer. And she works as a senior lecturer in social and cultural artificial intelligence. This is a great job title, congratulations. At King's College London in the Department of Digital Humanities. And her research in human-computer interaction and artificial intelligence investigates how people interact with and react to technologies, both past and future. Her book that I mentioned before examines the ethical and social implications of technology and intimacy. So what else can we say if not that we are looking forward to hear from you today? This is the Summer of Love dialogues at the Center for Digital Inquiry at Warwick. Let me also thank Nate Tukat, who's in the background. He's the director of the Center for Digital Inquiry. And I am Carolina Bandinelli, the curator of this series, which indeed I organized just because I wanted to hear the most interesting ideas from the people around. So I kind of created the summer school that nobody was creating for me, or the series of events. I wish this was a festival and we could sort of go dancing in the proper meaning of matinee, like after hours with robots. But perhaps this is gonna be for another year. Without further ado, I would invite Kate to start, and we'll have Belinda, and then I will open the floor to all the attendees. Hopefully, we can have a nice debate, who's always the best part of these events. Kate, the floor is yours. Thank you very much again for being here this morning.
Thank you very much for having me. So yeah, I was just going to do like a little run through of where we're at in the world today with sex robots. So this whole concept of creating artificial partners has been around for a very long time. There are Greek myths that describe this. There's the myth of Laodamea, whose husband died in battle, and she created a lifelike statue of him, which she took to bed with her and interacted with it. And we've got the story from the Roman poet Ovid about Pygmalion, who created the most beautiful statue that he fell in love with. And she was perfect because she wasn't flawed like the women around him. So he then asked for her to come to life, and he ended up marrying her and having children with her. So we have these stories, these narratives that go right back, and we see them sort of coming through the whole way through to our sci-fi today. And even the earliest sci-fi film, Metropolis, was about this female robot that then was provoking an uprising, but was very sexualized as well, performing an erotic dance. So this idea of the fembot is really consistent in the narratives. And you see the fembot idea going one of two ways. She's either very perfect and idealized and this wonderful, obedient partner, or she throws off the shackles of patriarchy, and she rises up and she's dangerous. So this femme fatale idea sort of gets across, what happens when women get too confident, women break their programming. So there's a feminist fear in there as well about women smashing the patriarchy. So it's really interesting how embedded this is in our subconsciousness, really. And of course, this leads to huge media sensationalism the minute anyone thinks that there could be a real sex robot. And I started researching this back in about 2015 because I kept seeing these headlines that said things like, sex robots are coming, men won't be able to tell the difference, it's the death of sex, it's the death of relationships. And I thought, this sounds ridiculous. It doesn't sound like anything that I've seen happening in the technology sphere. And what we really have today is a handful, like literally just a couple of workshops in the world that are trying to make sex dolls or love dolls that have some kind of animatronics in them. And that's it. And there are no commercially available sex robots yet, despite the headlines that say there are armies of them and that people are already, falling for these things. So there's really there've been several attempts to make these. There's really only one that's kind of come to market, but it's still not being shipped. So you can pre-order the Harmony robot from Abyss Creations, who make real dolls. And Harmony is a love doll, a sex doll, so completely immobile from the neck down, doesn't move, can't stand up on her own. And I'm gendering here and saying her. It's really an it, but it's easy to refer to it as a her. And so the only part of Harmony that currently moves is the face. And it's actually pretty good animation in the face, robotics, where she can smile and blink and turn her head and angle her head. And she has an AI personality. And that is a standalone personality. So you can actually just download the app for like $20 to your phone, if you have an Android phone, funny enough. And that's, it's really cool that the way this has been developed. There are issues, we'll get to those in a second, but that you can have this AI version, you don't have to have the robotic version. And I find that really, really interesting for a number of reasons. So the practical nature of this means that you cannot right now buy a sex robot. Once these eventually ship, like they say they will, and they keep saying, oh, it'll be in the next 6 months, it'll be in the next 6 months. But you hear that all the time with AI. When these actually ship, then maybe you can. These will be expensive, upwards of $10,000. And honestly, I see it as a really, really niche market. What I do think has got more opportunity is this AI version where you have a virtual companion on your phone. That I can see as being much more along the lines of a future of artificial intimacy. So we saw this huge kickback when these sex robots are mentioned in the media. We see this moralizing, this judgment about how it's going to have a negative effect, and it echoes similar debates that you see around things like video games. Excuse me. So there are fears that if we accept the idea of the sex robot into our society, that we'll end up with perhaps increased violence against women, or we'll end up with objectification of women. And one of those, I can see a concern there. I can definitely see that this could lead to further negative body image, because the sex dolls, the sex robots, the way they are shaped is in a very reductive female stereotype. So it's almost like life-size Barbie doll with large breasts, narrow waist, long legs, long blonde hair. There are they try to introduce diversity by bringing in this Latina version of one of these dolls, but it's really, rather than being diversity, it's actually just more of a fetishization. So, you know, it doesn't really add much there. There is an issue around racial representation as well. And there are no male versions, really. They say they're making a male version of this called Henry. But actually, this seems to be really a tokenistic nod to say, oh, look, we've thought about this for gay men and for women as well, for straight women as well. But the focus is always on extending the sex doll market into robotics. Now, I don't see anything particularly wrong with that. So in terms of these concerns about violence against women, in all the research I've done, that just didn't arise. So the people who own, who buy dolls, by and large, that community really rejects any idea of violence against them. This is not how the relationships work. And I know Belinda's done a lot of work in this area, and she'll be talking about this kind of thing. But essentially, the people who live with dolls tend to really cherish and value them, not just because these are expensive and crafted items, but because they genuinely care about the dolls themselves. And people buy them for a number of different reasons. Some as dolls that they can build a relationship with and project a relationship onto, so they live as if they are living with partners. There are others who buy them because they collect these beautiful works of art, because, you know, in many ways they are beautifully crafted. And there are others who buy them for sex, and the joy of this is for them that it is a doll that that's what they want, that's what they desire. Others get the dolls so that they can photograph and model them and create art out of the dolls. So to sort of to malign that community, I think, is really unfair, because this is essentially a hobbyist community. And I can see that people are concerned that, you know, that because this is an unusual one and quite a taboo area, of course people are going to be concerned that there's going to be negatives to this. But in all the research I did, when people who doll owners mentioned, when I talked about, you know, is there violence against these dolls, they were very quick to say that is not something we condone, and that is not something that the community condones either. So I don't see this spilling into real. I don't see a rule of violence against women. I certainly don't see it spilling into real life. And we've seen these arguments around video games as well. Oh, if you play violent video games, could this spill into real life? There's never been confirmation of that. In fact, quite the opposite. So this media sensationalism and this moralistic judgment really doesn't help. But it's tied into a larger landscape where sex that is still very, many parts of the sex that we have is still very taboo. And no matter how enlightened we think we are, being able to talk about things more openly, there are still taboo areas. And if it's unusual to us and our own particular desires, then we are sometimes reluctant to accept that. there are people will then bring in arguments like, oh, well, what about sort of childlike sex dolls? And that's been a big issue. Now, the companies that are developing these sex robots are not creating childlike sex robots. Let's get that clear. There are places out there that make childlike sex dolls, and these are illegal, certainly in the UK and a number of other countries. And there has been a crackdown in recent years on these. And in the UK, there was something like 123 of them seized at customs, and people were prosecuted for it. And of the 7 people, I think, that were prosecuted for importing and owning these childlike dolls, 6 of them were found to have images of child abuse on their computers. So we know there is a problem there, but it is illegal. And I think it's kind of a red herring to throw it into the mix with sex robots. We should acknowledge, however, that that does happen. But the reason I think that that sex robots won't take off as a mainstream thing in the form of the animatronic sex doll, practical reasons, really. It's very, very hard to make a human-like robot. It's really computationally expensive, technologically difficult, financially expensive. So it's very niche. And although there's a very wide community of doll owners, relatively speaking, not all of them will necessarily want robots. I don't think that this is going to go particularly wide or mainstream. It's just not really practical or feasible in that form. However, the AI side of this, where you have a standalone app, now that is proving much more popular. And we've already seen examples in Japan. There's the Gatebox, which is a little sort of glass cylinder that has a holographic projection of a female figure in it. It's only about that size. And that gives that virtual girlfriend experience. And again, this is heavily gendered. I do see that as a problem. This is very heavily gendered. But this idea that you can have a virtual girlfriend, again, you see parallels in sci-fi, Blade Runner 2049, for example, where there was the Joy, the kind of pocket girlfriend. And for some people, they find that to be a really sort of comforting way of getting companionship. And I don't necessarily think that that's a dangerous thing. So there's, again, concerns are raised that does this prevent people from forming sort of real relationships with humans? I think that there are always people who will get too involved with things. So there are always people who will spend too long on their phone, lack the constraints where it might start to become damaging to them, or play games too much and it might become damaging to them. So there's always that fear that could happen with any piece of technology. But a lot of people gain huge amounts from companionship, and we've seen it with the people who very quickly have become used to their voice assistants. And talk about how they chat to Alexa and get her to tell them a joke, or feel like there's company there. And that companionship element, it's not really dissimilar from having the radio or the TV on in your household to make it feel like there's other voices around you. We are social creatures, and we buy into this social relationship. We're not delusional about it. The people who own dolls, who want robots, who interact with these virtual girlfriends, this is not a delusion thinking it's real. It's buying into this process. And if you think of it outside the realms of sexuality, there are other uses for this. So therapy bots have become more mainstream, more widely used. And therapy bots will allow people to hold conversations about their mental health. Now, this is something that needs to be carefully done to make sure it has clinical support. But there's a lot to be gained from people being able to offload onto virtual characters or off to apps, because we are more likely to confide in those a lot of the time than we will in another person sitting in the same room as us. So there is a disclosure element that can be very, very positive. And we've seen that going right back to the very first chatbots like Eliza, where people were able to tell Eliza's secrets that they wouldn't confide to anyone else. So there is this sharing and this kind of relieving yourself of the burden by engaging with these kind of artificial companions. So I think that there are new opportunities here. It's a really interesting time to be studying this. We're seeing the emergence of the social category of social AI and social artificial agents, where we can form something that is not like a human-human relationship. It's not meant to replace a human-human relationship, but something that is in itself a new thing. And I see that as mostly positive. I think it has a lot of benefits, but we have to consider that development in an ethical manner. So, you know, how do we go about ensuring that our data is safe? How do we go about ensuring that we're not getting sucked in by, I don't know, some kind of, you know, corporate agenda? So, for example, you're in the middle of confiding something, and then they say, okay, well, if you want to confide a bit more, you've got to pay this upgrade fee. How do we get away from these kind of things? And how do we make sure that it's not to anyone's detriment? So is there a way of ensuring that we can put limits if need be? Although I'm sort of mostly against imposing direct regulations on tech. I think this should be something that people work out for themselves if it's not harming anyone else. So yeah, overall, I think that this can be a really positive thing. And I think that if we rethink sex tech as well, we don't have to go down the route of human-like sex robots. There are lots of interesting sex toys out there that we can do. We can create a sense of intimacy. We can use the technology to mediate between other humans. So it doesn't have to be a direct relationship with a machine. It could be technology used to bring humans together. So I think the potentials are really good. And while I have concerns, overall, I think it's quite a positive thing.
Thank you. It is refreshing not to be alarmed that everything is fucked up and we are doomed. I think I was quite interested in a media studies fashion on the history of remediation, how we can think about AI companionship like the radio and TV, like the good old radio that was there to keep you company while you were doing the chores. And I'm using a gendered metaphor or example consciously. However, that made me think of, I didn't research on these like systematically, but I taught a couple of classes. So I was, just looking around, and I noticed that, and there is a literature on it also, that perhaps the difference is the sexualization and gendering of artificial intelligence, of the various Alexa and Siri and Echo, etc. And I read once the reviews of Amazon Alexa, and they were very much eloquent in this respect, perhaps ironic, yet with more than a kernel of truth. There were a lot of males saying, oh, who needs a wife now that I have Alexa? And this is an anecdotal evidence, okay, but I think it's still revealing. One was sharing this whole story of his partner, his girlfriend, breaking up with him for a man better than him, and him being depressed, and eventually Alexa came and kind of rescued. So I think that when it comes to television and radio, they're very sort of gender neutral, like a non-sexual technology, whereas there's something about AI, also in the advertisements of AI. Like AI is the mother, is the partner, is Siri that tells the man, oh, you look stunning today. It is Alexa that tells the father how to fix a dinner for the little girl. So how would you sort of make sense of these elements? It seems to me like the element that perhaps it's a new element if we compare to other media technologies of companionship, let's say.
I completely agree. So AI is definitely heavily gendered, and we see it in the voice assistants that all started off with female voices. And to my mind, this is Silicon Valley trying to recreate the subservient woman, be it a wife, a mother, or a secretary. And it reflects the makeup of Silicon Valley, which is that it's dominated by white men. And AI as well has a massive problem. Only something around like 12% of people in AI are female. So I think that certainly when you think about AI more broadly, yes, there is that definite element where there is an assumption that the end user is the same as the developer, is a white male. And I've seen all sorts of arguments made about this, sort of like, oh, but women's voices are better received and women's voices are more easily heard. None of these stand up to scrutiny at all. So I've been through them and debunked them all. And it's not the case at all. So really, basically, all that we're saying is that women's voices are what they're used to. So they want to continue to perpetuate that narrative. So it doesn't have to be like that. And there have been some projects to try and change that. So there's been improvements in responses, in the actual responses given by the voice assistants, in that they used to be quite coy. If you talked dirty to them, they would go, like Alexa said, oh, I'd blush if I could, this kind of nonsense. So that's being addressed, thankfully. That is improving. But also, you can now set your voices to different things. So I actually don't really have voice assistants in my home. My partner has a Google Home and I hate it. But I know that I have got Siri set as a timer on my iPad, but I've got him set to Irish male voice, But I remember someone saying to me in a conference that I was talking about this, and they said, why can't you just return a different voice every time? So every time it just responds with either a different accent, or, it could be, sometimes it could be a man's voice, sometimes it could be a woman's voice. Sometimes it could be robotic, but even robotic voices, we tend to try and read gender into it. So I think that there's definitely that opportunity. There have been attempts to build a kind of a gender neutral platform voice, the voice assistant queue, for example. So this is definitely a problem, but it's not merely a problem. It's a problem that's systemic, and it is AI as a whole. And someone described AI a few years ago as a sea of dudes. And it's definitely a sea of dudes. But the nice thing is that because AI draws more and more on disciplines outside of just tech, that we're starting to see a lot more thought given to this. But for that, we really need the humanities, and we really need that critical perspective to say, okay, you can make the tech and you can do really cool things with the tech, but let's look at this from a social perspective or a cultural perspective. So I've got some hope that it's improving, but It's definitely gendered right now. And I think that is a problem.
Yeah, I also think it definitely is a problem the way it is gendered now. At the same time, I think it's also interesting that there is this sexualization of the voice, whether male or female or neutral, that perhaps there are things like the exploitation of a gendered, feminine, submissive kind of artificial slave on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the fact that there is an erotic of artificial.
Yeah, and even with the disembodied, I mean, if you look at the film Her, for example, so where the man falls in love with his operating system, and even though it's a disembodied thing, it's still sexualized. Okay, so it's Scarlett Johansson's voice, so automatically she's associated with this very sexy woman. But in addition to that, there's lots of flirtation and giggling, and there's all these cues are there for sexualization. So we don't get away from that even when it's just a voice. Definitely, that is still heavily done to engage consumers who are intended, whether consciously or unconsciously, intended to be men.
And so, concerning this eroticization, we are now moving to sex dolls, and actually, it seems like a bit a reversal. Perhaps I'm here just doing a simplistic bridge, but sex dolls, they have no voice or artificial intelligence, but there is the material, there is the body there. And so
yes. So kind of the
interesting parallel in a sense.
Yeah. So I think there is that, and one of the things I find, so my PhD student and I did an analysis last year of the advertising around the doll, the kind of the artificial, the AI real doll application, and look at the sex dolls. And we also interviewed sex doll owners who would actually prefer it not to be called sex dolls, doll owners, and said, that they all remarked, and the advertising backed this up, that the emphasis is on companionship there rather than the sex. And so these are being sold as companionship things. And the people we talked to said, sex is not the main driver here. It's definitely companionship. And I find that quite interesting, because something that is treated by the media as being a very heavily sexualized thing, and that is a very debauched thing or a perverted thing, is actually much more about the companionship that is projected onto these dolls. So I just find that fascinating.
So, Belinda, who better than you can tell us more about it?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me too. And it's lovely to see Kate again after all these years. I think what's really interesting about this topic is how uncomfortable it makes so many people feel. And if I'm sure Kate would agree that any dinner party conversation where people start talking to you about your research, oh, what is it that you do, Belinda? What is it that you do, Kate? Will make people very, very uncomfortable. And, I can understand that there are certainly legitimate concerns about sex robot technology, but it's just really interesting that when we put technology and sex together, it becomes, I guess, a subject that people really recoil at. So I guess for that reason, I wanted to frame my chat today around two questions that at every dinner party I get asked when I talk about the fact that I research men who have dolls and what they think about sex robot technology. And those two questions are really simple, but I think that they can help us understand a bit more about the community. So the first one is, who would want a sex robot? Because I always get asked that. And the second question is, why? Why would people want a sex robot? So I guess in answering those questions, I'll talk a little bit about the amazing transdisciplinary research on the topic, including Kate's own research. And I'll talk a little bit about the research that I've done into, I'm going to call it this, the sex doll community, only because in a public domain sense, people understand sex dolls, but I do recognise that the community does prefer the terms love dolls or dolls, and I would prefer to talk that way, except for the fact that to avoid confusion, I'll mention sex dolls. So I wanted the research that I've done into this particular community is to look at a series of discussion threads. There are about just over 500 posts in various discussion threads that I analysed. And I was particularly interested in the first study about the way in which sex doll owners talked about sex robot technology, and in particular Harmony, I guess the most sophisticated sex robot that we currently have. In development, that is. So how they were talking about Harmony, and one of the sex doll owners in those discussion threads was beta testing a version of Harmony. So, and that particular user was kind of cataloguing and journaling his experiences with Harmony for the rest of the community. So I was really interested in that. That study is published in Sexualities in that journal. And then the other study that I've been doing, and it's been ongoing since last year, but it was kind of put off because of the pandemic. And that's just conducting interviews with sex doll owners, just to, I guess, test the findings from the first study, whether they were accurate. And so far, I guess it's been pleasing to find that they have been accurate, but I mean, it's an ongoing study, so I'm happy to be proven wrong. So to that first question of who would want a sex robot, it's really interesting that we can look at it through different lenses. So media representations, both fictional and non-fictional, tell us a lot about our attitudes to sex robots and who we think would be the likely market for sex robot technology. In fiction, I mean, we've referred to the disembodied kind of AI in the film Her. We've seen human-robot relationships represented in films like Ex Machina. There was actually a German film that I'm really looking forward to seeing. It premiered at the German Film Festival. It's called I'm Your Man, and it's supposedly really, really good. And that was just this year that it's come out. Fictional TV series, Real Humans. Then we've got books like Ian McEwan's Machines Like Me. And it's interesting in let's just take Ex Machina as an example, that it's the person who's presented there as someone who is a user of sex robots is someone who's very rich and powerful, socially isolated, and a bit of a misogynistic tech genius who invents robots, or rather gynoids, so female robots, and he has sex with them, and lo and behold, it's really handy, but they also do all the housework and they do all the cooking as well. Sign me up for one of those. And then, of course, in news media coverage, human robot relationships are in the research that's been done thus far. I know of 2 studies in particular looking at news media coverage of sex robots, and they've surmised that the coverage is rather cliched. But in particular, the way in which sex robot users, or the potential market for sex robots, if you like, and also the sex robots themselves are very, well, obviously gendered, but it's also very stereotypically gendered in the way that they're represented. So, for instance, the men who would be the likely consumers of sex robots are represented in news media, according to these 2 studies, as, these lonely, nerdy, socially isolated, kind of detached men, the kind of the gamer types who live in the proverbial basement. They have mental health problems, they're lacking in social skills. So it's really, really interesting findings from those 2 studies, and one was in 2016 and the other one was in 2019. And then, of course, we have, in terms of who would be the likely market for sex robots, we've got the empirical academic research that's been done into the sex doll community. And as Kate mentioned, sex robot technology is very much in its infancy. We don't have a commercially available product at the moment. So the likely market for sex robots, we think, is going to come from the sex doll community. So there was a study done in 2012 that found that the likely market for sex robots, or indeed those people who buy and use sex dolls, are white, heterosexual, single men who are gainfully employed. And indeed that's formed, I guess, the typical profile for a sex doll user and the would-be profile for a sex robot user should one become commercially available. We don't have a lot of research about female sex doll owners. According to Matt McMullen, I read this stat a little while ago, so it might be out of date, but he mentioned that female consumers for sexual technologies represent around 10% of his overall sales. So that's interesting. So that's kind of just a bit of an overview of different ways that sex doll users and would-be sex robot users are represented. As far as the question of why would someone want to purchase a sex robot, again, this is something that dominates dinner party conversations, certainly the ones that I'm a part of. And there are 4 reasons, certainly, that I've talked about in my research. I know Kate's talked about in her research as well. And the first one is the obvious one, is for sex. And Sarah Valverde's survey of love doll owners, and she conducted this survey back in 2012, and it was really the first comprehensive survey of the sex doll community. And she found that 70% of people who participated in the survey owned a sex doll purely for sexual purposes. And I guess that's not so surprising for the reasons that Kate mentioned, that, sexual artifacts have certainly been a part of human history for thousands of years. John Danaher, who published a really great book called Robot Sex, he's wrote a chapter about that started with this really fascinating story about how in 2005, there were a bunch of archaeologists who were on a dig in a cave in the Swabian Alps, somewhere in Germany. And they came across this highly polished piece of stone, and it was 20 centimeters by in length and 3 centimeters thickness. And they worked out that it was 28,000 years old, and it was the world's oldest dildo. It was certainly very phallic shaped. So, I mean, I guess sex dolls, sex robots, they're not highly polished pieces of stone. And certainly their human resemblance, their situatedness, their embodiedness really arouses much debate about problems with objectification of women and problems with consent. But I think the point that Danaher's making in his book is that it's possible to see sex dolls, or indeed sex robots, as the latest, I guess, technological advancement on a historical continuum of sexual artifacts. Now, what I found in my own research about this notion of sex dolls for sexual reasons, you know, the motivator is sex. What I found in the responses of the men that I've interviewed, when they said that sexual gratification was the reason why they owned a sex doll, I found that there are actually nuances in their responses, and it was so fascinating. So, for instance, one of my interviewees said that he and his human partner had differing sexual drives, and that having sex with his doll kind of took the pressure off his human relationship. And it rather than disrupt his human relation, so I guess he was saying, rather than him disrupting his relationship by engaging a sex worker, by watching pornography, you know, by hiring an escort, by having an affair, for instance, he, I guess, addresses, satisfies his sexual drive with his sex doll, and then can pursue his human relationship in a much more fulfilling way for him. So I think that's important to note. Another sex doll owner that I interviewed said that actually it deepened his emotional connection with his human partner, having a sex doll, because he found that it took sex off the table, that he didn't need to keep pressuring his human partner for sex when he felt like sex, and that he was able to explore the emotional side of their relationship. So I guess when we talk about sex dolls being purely a sexual outlet, there are actually, as I said, nuances, qualifications. There's a bigger story there too. And obviously another reason why someone would purchase a sex doll, or indeed would purchase a sex robot, would be for companionship. And there have been several surveys, again, exploring perceptions of human-robot relationships in the general population, as well as specifically in the sex doll community. And I think in all, they point to a more complex and reflexive relationship between humans and sex dolls, or between a potential relationship between humans and sex robots. So there were two surveys in 2016, 2017, and that was just a survey generally of people in the US, not particularly sex doll owners. And they found that a majority of people would purchase a sex robot should it become available. They would purchase a sex robot for companionship reasons. In one of those two surveys, 59% of people believe that sex robots could actually offer companionship and could contribute to improving sex lives for other people, and could potentially even minimise harm. So minimise disease, minimise emotional pain. Again, there was another survey in 2018. It was a questionnaire of 83 doll users. And that particular study, Lancaster, James and Bentley, found that doll users actually individuate their sex dolls. So they're not sort of, they're not generic in any way. They give them personalities. They see them more than just as kind of sexual outlets. In fact, they engage in very loving and respectful parasocial relationships with their sex dolls. And I think my research has certainly borne out all of the findings of those studies as well. As I mentioned, that analysis of the doll forum that I conducted, and just it was an analysis of all the interactions, of photos, of conversations that people were having about their sex dolls, about the possibility and potentials of harmony as a sex robot. And I found that conversation and companionship were two of the very prominent reasons why men in that community had bought a sex doll and would consider buying a sex robot should it become available. And they'd in fact attributed very human qualities to their sex dolls, everything from kind of self-care and jealousy to a sense of fun, moodiness, kind of a nurturing personality. And it was really interesting too that some men some men would just talk as users of sex dolls. So they would talk about their dolls. Other men would actually take the point of view of their doll companions and talk as if they were the doll to another man's doll. So the dolls were having a conversation. And I found that really, really fascinating. And then again, as I mentioned, those follow-up interviews that I've been doing with sex doll owners, that finding of companionship is really being supported in those interviews. So when I asked one interviewee, how would you describe your relationship with your doll? He said companionship, simulated feminine presence in an otherwise masculine household. We have fun with fashion, makeup and hair, and occasional simulated sexual activity. Another interviewee didn't want to use the word companion when he described his doll relationship, but he said, I was surprised to find myself forming what feels like a simplified form of a loving relationship with my doll. I find it very comforting to spend time with my doll. And then another one who thought that companionship with his doll was limited, actually described his relationship with his doll as sleeping partners. And he said, the reason is that I sleep much better with one of my dolls in bed with me. So it's really fascinating that companionship is very much a part of these human doll relationships. And then of course, another reason why someone would purchase a sex doll, potentially purchase a sex robot is, as Kate mentioned, because they're collectors. It's an artifact, they're hobbyists. It has aesthetic appeal. Some have mentioned hanging dolls on their walls and admiring the beauty of the doll, hanging it as they would hang any other beautiful artwork. In one interview, one sex doll user said to me, I like to have one or two of them, that is dolls sitting in the living room just to be there. And he said, no conversations, no partnership, more like a kind of dynamic art. Sometimes we dress them, different posing. And then he said, in sex, yeah, it happens, but not too often. I'm really interested in the aesthetics, in the photo shoots, more than anything else. And then I guess another reason is as a fetish. So some people have a particular fetish, but there's some really fascinating research about that too, about whether sexual attraction to machines, to computers, robots, androids, whether that constitutes a fetish or whether that is a legitimate sexual identity. Some argue that technosexuality, which is defined as sexual activity combined with technology, some argue that technosexuality actually deviates from some sort of statistical sexual norm and therefore constitutes a fetish. And then that was in a study in 2017. And then, of course, others have argued that, if your primary sexual identity comes through the use of technology, you are what is called a digisexual. You have what's called digisexuality, and in fact, you indeed have a legitimate sexual identity. It's not just a fetish. So alongside sex, companionship, using a sex doll as a form of art, as an artifact, and then of course the fetish. What I wanted to add to kind of this list was connection, because one of the most compelling findings of the research I've been doing into the sex doll community is that establishing and maintaining connections with other members of the community is a really important part of doll ownership. So in those discussion threads that I analysed, the chats between the men were punctuated by these expressions of emotion, of closeness, emotional closeness, of intimacy, of friendship. And that led me to conclude that actually peer bonding was a primary factor driving the members to interact on this particular site. And I think that that's because these fora are largely safe spaces. They're spaces for men who have a particular hobby or sexual preference, to be able to talk in a way that's free and there's no judgment. And having those conversations in the offline world would expose them to ridicule, to marginalisation, and so I guess that in that space it's very much a sense of camaraderie and peer bonding, what I called forming male homosocial bonds. So I'm also seeing that, interestingly enough, I was testing those findings of the first research and the second research, the interviews. I'm finding those that those same findings are accurate. So that one doll user described to me at length his interactions with other members of the site, and I'm just going to quickly. How are we going for time? I'm hoping I'm not taking up too much time here.
Go ahead, no worries.
Okay, all right. Yeah, and I found this particular response really interesting. So he said, a number of people have commented on my dolls thread, including one member with whom I found a surprising amount of common ground. We've had deep and broad discussions about all kinds of subjects tangential to dolls. Sharing my thoughts and feelings about my doll feels good and sometimes sets off fascinating conversations where we compare notes or get fairly philosophical. Posting photos of my doll and getting positive comments in response satisfies my need for approval and reinforces that I'm not crazy for finding my doll beautiful. It also excites me that something that I can create can bring good feelings to others. I also enjoy visiting others' threads to leave my own comments on their photos and stories. It makes me feel like I'm part of something, and I want to give others the same good feelings that they've given me. And then that was borne out in more interviews that I conducted, again asking the question, what's your primary motivation for owning a love doll, sex doll? One of them said simply friendship. A group of people with common interest in dolls and photography, of which some have become really good friends. So, our engagements, I think, with sex dolls reveal essential features about us as humans. I think about human life and our behaviour, and I think our quest to find out who would own a sex doll and potentially a sex robot, and why someone would want to own a sex doll or sex robot, tell us much about our interest in the impacts of this kind of technology in our most intimate sphere. And in doing the research, I guess the biggest revelation, well, for me at least, was that findings of connection. So it's actually the sex dolls are mediating relationships between men, that through these sex dolls, men are actually establishing and building a sense of community and intimacy with one another. So it's actually the technology that's teaching us so much about our humanity.
Thank you very much, Belinda. And so I'm gonna open to the floor for a final debate in a move that I very much like, which is that every participant is upgraded, so to speak, to panelists, so that we can have the sense of being in a room together talking about these topics. And but I can't resist asking you a question. When you were talking, and perhaps this is a sort of a simple thing, but it really made me realize how I always focused on the aspect of the sex in sex dolls instead of the aspect of the doll. Because when you were talking about how people humanize, how these men humanize their dolls, how they talk to them, how they attribute characteristics and feelings, how they would have two different dolls meeting and chatting, it is an experience I can relate very much as a woman who used to be a little girl playing with dolls. Like I still remember the names of my dolls, their characters are very different from each other, and I would have different relationships with my dolls. So there is this childlike aspect, this playful aspect that it has an interesting also theoretical and of course experiential connection with sex and play, and also this sleeping companionship. It just reminded me of the teddy bear. I mean, when my partner is not with me, I do have it's not a bear, but a teddy bunny to sleep with me, because it's nice, and I still have all these. They're not dolls; they're mostly rabbits, because I like rabbits. It's not a fetish; just I like the rabbit as an animal, and they're cute. And so I still have these rabbits, and they have names. So there is an aspect of playing as adults, and the way it connects to sex. It can be problematic, but it's definitely interesting. So I wonder what you think. And then we have two brilliant comments in the chat, but perhaps I can ask Nate in the meantime to to invite participants to be panelists. This meeting is recorded, so if you don't want your face to be recorded, then turn the camera off. However, I would really like you to keep your camera on, because it's nice to have the impression that there are actual people there as much as possible. So please, Belinda, what do you think? What do you think of it, this childlike, this playful aspect?
Oh, Carolina, I'm sorry, I'm having a coughing fit at the moment. But I think, sorry.
I can keep on talking.
Oh, I've been trying to kick the flu for the last couple of weeks. So, sorry, but it must have been all the talking. But yeah, look, I think it's so interesting, the doll dimension in Sex Doll. I would love to write a book that traced the history of human doll relationships, male and female relationships with dolls, from the, right back to ancient times all the way to Victorian England. I mean, I think the doll aspect is very interesting, and it really taps into this notion of it being a hobby for many doll owners. I guess that the terminology is so interesting, because I always trip up when I have to say sex dolls, but that seems to be, as I said before, the way that people understand the relationship that principally men in this circumstance have with dolls. They understand it to be just a purely sexual one. But it's far more complicated than that. And I think that the doll aspect is a really interesting one and would be worthwhile further exploring.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would be very interested in reading a book that traces the story of our relationship with dolls. There is a very interesting comment question by Trudy Barber. Trudy, if you want, can you just jump in with your mic and come and offer us your comment question?
Hi,
Hello.
Trudy.
Hi, Kate. Oh, it's really nice to see you. Yeah, I found it really, really interesting. Yeah, I was thinking in terms of the context of the pandemic and how it's affected the way we interact with each other on an intimate level, and how the need for just cuddling or just being in the presence of another person has really changed, I think, the way that we appreciate being, in this technological environment that we are now, like the way you want to see people's faces and things. I think the whole pandemic experience may completely change the general context of how we articulate these relationships between humans and technology. And I think it's surprised a lot of people, actually, as to how their lives have changed by the lack of being with other people, and the only way to be with the ones they love is through, like what we're doing now. So I'd be really interested to see what the panel thinks about that. And just another quickie for Belinda about dolls. What do you think about the women that love to collect these real baby dolls, and I find that context just a little bit scary. Anyway, over to you guys.
Thank you.
I should say that Trudy is an expert on cybersex. She is amazing. She's been around since the early days of it, doing research on it, and she should answer this question, her own question. But I think it's really interesting that when lockdown started, there was a surge in sex toy sales, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, sex toys are going to be the big thing." And of course, you know, it didn't continue at that, because you don't need multiple sex toys. You can have multiple sex toys, but you don't need to keep buying them. Anyway, one of the teledildonics community was very interested. They're like, is it finally going to be a time when we can have, you know, the internet connected sex toys working well? But you don't even need that, because it's enough if you have just a video connection, or even just to message people, to have that bond, to have that intimacy online, to have pleasure. You don't necessarily need to have these connected toys, although, you know, that can be fun. So I think that definitely there was this whole emergence of the idea of skin hunger, the idea that you miss this physical touch. And if I could just do one thing and build one piece of technology, it would be something to give you a hug over the internet. I would love that. But I was I was in doing a panel a couple of months ago with someone who's an expert in touch, a neuroscientist who's an expert in touch, and somebody who runs cuddle workshops. And they were talking about why we like this touch. And they were saying, if you do mirroring of touch, so if you are on a video and you both do the same actions at the same time, that can feel almost like you're being hugged. And I thought that's really nice. More people should know about that, because it's not the same, but, you know, it's getting the same kind of responses. So yeah, I think there's definitely, we are forming strong, intimate bonds via technology. And that isn't just the pandemic, it was there before, but I think that's really intensified how people think about the way technology can be used. And there is a rethink of our connections that way. And I think just because it's brought it to the forefront of people's minds. So before, when people would have dismissed perhaps online communities having strong bonds, they're now seeing how that is possible, and they're more accepting of it, I think.
Yeah, it's I totally agree with Kate. The pandemic has certainly intensified those intimate relationships that we have with various technologies, and with one another through technology. As far as to Trudy's question about the dolls, I mean, I honestly don't know a lot about it, and you, Trudy, you probably know more than me, but I have heard of is it the Born community? Of women who have the Born dolls. But I do think that it would be such a fascinating study to compare and contrast our relationships with dolls based on gender too, how men and women relate to dolls of various kinds, and indeed how we dress up as well. I think that there's a dimension of cosplay here that you could unpack. Dressing up as a particular kind of doll. And of course, you know, the adult dolls, the adult men and women who, you know, they put on the nappies and they have the dummy in their mouths and enact sexual play through that. So yeah, that would be fascinating, really would be.
Can I ask Trudy a question while she's here? I want to ask, because Trudy has looked at people who are, I guess, technosexual and who try to make themselves into gynos and androids. I was just wondering if she would tell us a little bit about that, because that's been really interesting too, to hear about the people who themselves want to be those sex robot.
Yeah, there's I mean, there's one classic sort of influencer YouTube person called Venus Angelic, and it's a bit of an old thing now. And she would go to great lengths to make herself look like an android. And she does it as a makeup event online. And she goes through all the processes of actually making herself look like this stylized gynoid, including this kind of a silvery bodysuit and a certain really large what they called the go in your eye, I got brain fog from bloody pandemic. So so that she actually looks like this kind of weird robot, and then she sort of positions herself in these kind of sex doll positions. But there have been, I mean, I did a lot of studies of people in fetish clubs and things like that. There were people who would dress up completely in this kind of silvery suit and do that, you know, that kind of funky 1980s robot dance movement as if they were robots going around the fetish club. And it's something that I think is deeply entrenched in our sense of being in relation to the sense of maybe non-being of a machine. So, and I think some people want to just get rid of being human and just want to be the machine just for that, just so they can escape from the pressures of being human. But I mean, it's like people who like to have sex with balloons. Some people like to dress up as robots, and I don't know, maybe you have to spray yourself down with WD-40 before you get into any kind of exciting activity.
Thank you, Trudy. That's fascinating. When you were mentioning the pandemic and whether the pandemic might have intensified the ways in which we use technology for sexual, erotic, or I would add also romantic purposes, I'm now doing a research on dating apps used during the pandemic, well, not only during the pandemic, but also. And whereas, I don't know what's the right term, if it is cyber sex, but anyway, engaging in erotic sexual intercourses with other people through the internet is not a new thing. Perhaps it is something that long distance couples have known for a long time. But what I'm observing is that also people that never did it before, they would engage, and somehow I would also learn the skills, the tips to make it meaningful, to make it pleasant. And also another phenomenon that perhaps it was not, it has to do with the specificity of the pandemic, is this one-off cyber sex intercourse. So you would meet somebody and just have a hookup, a digital hookup without with a stranger. So I think there's something, and I don't know if it is here to stay, somehow just adding to the spectrum of the ways in which we can express our erotic sexual self, or if it is just, oh, I'm so isolated, I would do anything. So let's see, this is just a kind of an insight from it. This is a research that I'm doing really right now. But I would call Afri Campbell, and sorry if I mispronounce your name, but please come in and offer us your question, comment.
Hi, sorry, I didn't want to overload your Wi-Fi for some reason. Belinda, I was really interested in your talk about what went on in the chat rooms and the sort of range of responses from the participants. And I wondered if they ever actually talked about their partners in the sense of an awareness of social attitudes towards objectification, because the dolls themselves are so convincingly gendered. I guess the reason I'm curious is because, when you get to, you have a safe space where people are finding friendship because of shared common interests, it can become a sort of echo chamber, and the rest of the world recedes. A safe space in itself can start to become something rather different. So I wondered if they sort of shut off from their real lives or real other human relationships to be able to sort of join together in a club which focuses exclusively on their own desires.
Yeah, it's such a it's a really fascinating question, and in fact it formed one of the questions that I asked my interviewees, because it's I guess critics of sex robot technology always latch on to the potential for objectification of women. And indeed, that's a genuine concern if that's all we see, a very, stereotypical representations of womanhood represented in the generation of sex robots, if that's what eventuates. So I'm actually trawling through to have a look at exactly what they said so I don't misquote So one of them said, so my question was, what would you say to critics of love dolls and sex robots who are concerned about the potential for female objectification in the appearance and use of these devices? And the answer from one of them was, I feel as if the reverse actually happens. I'm less inclined to objectify women as there's not any pressure to sexually interact with them. So I rarely have an underlying sexual agenda. That said, I can see where people, women generally, could and would feel threatened by love dolls, as it totally removes a sexual power they have over males. So that was one response. Others actually talked from memory. They talked about the fact that they absolutely adore their sex dolls and would hate for me to use that term sex dolls, because they're, they call them by name, or, would refer to them to me as being dolls. But I mean, one of them actually sent me a series of photographs of him and his doll, completely unsolicited, but just wanted to prove to me that the doll was more than just a sexual outlet, or was more than just a plaything, or was more than just something that could be objectified. And there was a real earnestness to, as I said, to prove to me at least that this was a genuine relationship that he was having with his dolls. In that case, it was with his doll rather than dolls. Some of them have more than one doll. So yeah, I mean, I think different sort of responses to the question of objectification. But overall, what I saw in both my analysis of the doll forum and of the interviews was this individuation of dolls, of really genuinely embedding the dolls into their everyday lives, of going out to restaurants and cafes with their dolls and taking photos of them with their dolls and sharing those photos in the forum. Of being at home, watching the football with a can of beer, and there's my doll, whatever her name is, sitting next to me, and here's a photo of us enjoying the football on a Friday night, so to speak. So it's really, it's really very interesting, the way that they respond to that particular question. I got the sense that there was that I offended some of them by asking that question. So I don't know whether that answers your question. I think more interviews need to be done to sort of probe that a bit further, at least in that particular research project.
Could I just ask if both you and Kate feel that, given the extraordinary possibilities of technology, that actually we're en route towards empowering more human-machine relationships that will flourish, which range from companionship to sex, but that is a trend that allows us, in a sense, to control relationships in a firmer way, because after all, it's the human relationships, the human to human, that are messy and complicated. And these kind of technologies allow us to essentially assert and curate our human relationships more effectively.
I totally see that, and I don't, and I've seen that put forward as a very negative thing, that we are in some way replacing a very necessary human-to-human contact, and yet I don't necessarily think it is a negative thing. I think people get a lot out of it, in the same way that, I mean, Belinda mentioned sort of parasocial relationships, in the same way that we identify with fictional characters and wish, fanfic is such a huge area. Nobody seems to have a problem with people getting obsessed by fictional characters in their own universes. So I don't see it as a negative thing at all. And I think it's not replacing that direct human contact, but yes, there is that element of curation, of an individual, of personalization. And I've been told that by people who object to this, that but the thing is, you should have human relationships, and you should have messy relationships, and that's why. There's nothing to say that one is inherently better than the other, I don't think, unless it's causing you as an individual some kind of trauma or harm. I don't really see a problem with that, but maybe that's just my weird stance on this. But one thing I just wanted to come back to what Belinda was saying about, did you, the feeling that you might have offended people during this research. I find myself getting more and more protective of the doll community the more I talk to them, because I think they're so maligned in so many ways. And in some ways I don't want to just keep saying they, because it sounds like I'm putting a whole community under a microscope and kind of like having them in this little petri dish that, we analyze every move like lab specimens. And the one thing I like to try and get across, and I think Belinda's probably very similar, is that this is just a hobbyist group. This is just a normal bunch of people who happen to have a different interest than the rest of us. And I feel, I get quite incensed on their behalf when they get maligned in the media with these stories about how everyone's a deviant and a pervert. So, I've met some such wonderful, normal people that just happen to have an interest in dolls.
Thank you. It's really refreshing, Kate. You are very optimistic. I really like it. There's this
maybe foolishly so.
No, I don't think so, actually. No, and I think that it's true. And also to look at an object of research, you sort of have to get rid of the biases that one might have, and the closer you look at things, and the less they look like perverted, especially when it comes to sex. I'm talking specifically about sex, but I feel like extending the question of Afric to Trudy as well, that has been studying these for a long time. So what do we think of these of this topic of objectification? And then Afric, because I know that you published on these topics as well, I'm curious to know how you would answer your own question.
I'm just curious about why women, I suppose it's always obvious that the first gendered sex toy that comes out is taken up by men. Seems to me that there's, plenty of potential and opportunity for women to make more use of tech sex and to manage our own lives and our own desires and our own sort of diversity of partners. That's what really puzzles me. I suppose it's the sort of censorious Catholic Protestant thing of, we mustn't deviate into other spaces. But I'm always surprised by when I talk to girlfriends or when I, doing research for the book, how censorious women are about this whole process, when I would have thought that in some ways, sexual gratification, you can solve a lot of problems by not having another human involved at certain times. So why are women so negative?
I wonder if there's a thing with, so I've been thinking about this before in terms of sex tech, because the most widely sold sex toy is a vibrator, which is essentially a disembodied body part, but has now been abstracted into sort of beautiful ornaments and even things like that. And I wonder, is it because companionship is so strong, is it that the sex dolls, as well as being made by men for men, they allow a degree of emotional connection that men have been socialized out of in a lot of relationships, so that women being the emotional gatekeepers and men not feeling they can have that emotional bond. I wonder, is there that kind of toxic masculinity aspect to it that is more compelling to have the female form of the sex doll, whereas women find that emotional connection more easily through socialization? It's just a thought. I don't know for sure, but I always wonder if that is why there's the full body form as opposed to the artificial vagina, for example, which has been around for a very long time. But it's definitely more than that. It's about the embodiment too.
Interesting.
Trudy, what do you think?
Right. It's interesting having watched and observed this kind of thing. I always say this, Kate's always heard me saying this before, for the last 30 plus years. And I'm at a stage in my own life where things like menopause and technology that deals with the menopause and the aging woman, the croning woman in a sense, is kind of left out of some of these arguments. And I think we need to think about the objectification of the sex doll as this sexy young available body. But then when you come through to the Cronin context, the body transforms and changes. I mean, HRT was absolutely brilliant, but they stopped making my HRT and I couldn't take it anymore. And I've suddenly overnight become my grandmother. So that's the kind of, I don't want to lose my sexuality, my intense notion of my sexual self, but it kind of dissipates into this different context. And I'm wondering where technology can now come into that conversation of women going through these different processes, because it all seems to be focused on, that's the sort of certain sexualized context that people have when they are, mature adults. But then what happens beyond then? And I think the whole context of what Kate was saying about the sort of cuddling robots kind of thing, I think there's a lot of rich information to be found in this context in terms of the aging sexual body. And I think this is where maybe a lot of new technologies and new ways of looking at intimacy could probably come into place, and the objectification of that, in terms of, oh, she's an old biddy, she's not thinking about sex anymore, and all that sort of stuff. That whole kind of context of the older person, I think needs to be brought into the discussion. That's just generally.
Trudy, let's do work on this. I love this so much, and I want to do stuff on this. You and I should get together and do some stuff on this.
Yeah. Spot on.
Cool.
Yeah. Before I retire, dear.
There's life in you yet.
Oh, I bloody well hope so.
Yeah, I think there is a sense of, I was thinking about it before in terms of we mentioned gender so many times, and also women, but then what women? And I think that through the remarks is truly fascinating. It would make me feel much comfortable in aging. And it's true that the middle-aged woman is the real invisible in also the narratives about gender and when it comes to sex. And I think that this plays, for instance, for me, I am almost 37 now, and so I see an horizon of growing, and I relate. I start to understand and empathize with women older than me, perhaps even more than with women younger than me. So I feel like I'm in this moment of passage. And also when it comes to motherhood, I'm not a mother, and I don't know if I will be. But anyways, there is a sense in which at some point your sexuality is just thrown out of the window, and nobody is doing anything for it. So perhaps if we can have some of those, I don't know, trendsetter culture engineers, it's a bit of a joke, but I think it is, and somehow these talks for me is related to, before I was looking at us at the panel, I was like, we are all women talking about these sex dolls, sex robots, talking about men, mostly men users, because this is what the empirical research of yours allow us to do. But clearly we must be interested as women in this topic, because it's all women here of different generations and nationalities, etc. So also, whose technology? When we talk about digital sex, whose sex and whose technology is there? And on the other hand, one could think of all, the history of sex toys, and dildos have been there forever. So there is also a sense in which women have a particular relationship with sex toys and with artificial phalluses. There's a scene in Sex and the City when at one point Charlotte doesn't go out of her flat for like a couple of weeks until someone goes like, okay, you are with a rabbit dildo, aren't you? And I was just like, oh yes, okay. So I don't know what it's just it's not really a question, but it's just a suggestion.
That's a really interesting point. And actually that episode of Sex and the City kicked off a huge surge in sex toy sales and sort of broke one of the taboos around vibrators, but it was still a really moralistic episode in that all the other women in Sex and the City said that it wasn't good enough, that she should have a real man and not a vibrator. Why? So, it's like, even though the vibrator was working perfectly well, better than a man. But that was very interesting to watch just how the landscape of sex tech development changed after that, because people suddenly thought, oh, it's okay to do this. It's been on TV. And I'm really interested in this. Just sparked a thought about truly talking about sex tech and aging. And a newspaper once ran a story because I'd said about, you know, why do we desexualize older people? Like when they go to care homes, suddenly we expect them that, you know, to be completely uninterested in sex, even though we have surveys that say people are having sexual activity right into their 90s. And yet we put, you know, relatives into care homes where they're in single beds with windows in the doors and they're not supposed to form partnerships, and we get offended if they do. So I think there's definitely space for right into very old age to talk about this. But the interesting thing about the sex doll and the sex robot is they don't age, and there's an immortality and a stasis in that body, to the point where there was a really interesting article about what happens to people's sex dolls when they die. And they asked owners, you know, what's going to happen? Well, you know, because this is going to outlive you. And some people said, I want to be cremated and I want my ashes put into the doll, or I want to bequeath it to my children. And you know, that whole idea of the immortal AI as well. But of course, we know that in practice, these aren't entirely immortal. And with AI, you know, the next upgrade of your computer can wipe out the software that you've been running for years. So there is a lifespan, but it's a different lifespan to ours. So how do we match this life where you age, but your virtual companion doesn't age? And I think that's a fascinating area.
And I wonder perhaps whether there would be a market for an aging sex doll, whether, you know, it's a particular predilection that people might have, that they would prefer to have a sex doll or indeed a sex robot that's in their 70s or 80s. And in fact, that would be a nice representation of some diversity within the generation of sex dolls / potential sex robots too. If we saw those different bodies, different colours, different sizes.
And then I wonder, you know, because I agree, and then I think, you know, but then if I was being offered, you know, to basically objectify someone that I fancied, am I going to go for the youthful body, you know, the hot person, or am I going to want them to be a bit older and wrinklier? And there is, of course, we all have this guilt of objectification at times, where there are things that we find attractive, and it's kind of innate in us. You know, I'm not a big fan of evolutionary psychology and these ideas of different cues and stuff, but some of them are clearly there, and there are things that draw our attention. So maybe we're just all doomed to find the young hot bodies attractive.
Can I just come in here?
Sure.
From a fine art context of observing the body and doing life drawing, more often than not, the aesthetics of looking at a mature body when you're drawing them is, I'm talking about analog drawing, you know, with a charcoal and a piece of paper, is that there's this erotic sense of forming the body on the page. And that exploration of the planes of the body, of a maturer body, a lumpier body, a more cuddlier body, is something that I think could be explored in how we perceive aging within virtual spaces. If you have a virtual avatar, you could make that virtual avatar a bit more, not realistic, but more having the contours of maturity, rather than looking like, you know, some big boobed robot woman that you see in a lot of the virtual reality experiences that I've looked at. So I think to go back to somebody like Lucian Freud's drawings of the body may give us another insight as to how we could develop other ways of looking at the body and experiencing the body, I think.
Yeah, I think this is a very inspiring analogy. I did an art high school, and so I used to draw the body like live for years, and that's totally true. Like from the point of view of someone who's drawing, so looking at the shapes, interested in the lights and shadows and the materialities, like the perfect fit body is the most boring. You don't want to draw it. It's very, very boring. So the more the body has folds and, you know, labyrinths of flesh and lights. So perhaps we should go back to the drawer, because then, well, then it's also a bit who's gaze, no? Who is that that impose a gaze? I guess this is quite a well-known argument. We are almost, we are in our 90 minutes, but if you don't mind staying another few minutes, I have a question from Belinda from before that I think perhaps now could be a good time also last time. I don't want to miss the chance, because and it's again about women and how women relate to sex dolls and sex and technology, etc. For how it is developed now, not in our republic of like aging male sex robots kind of thing. Anyways, so you talk about these men that were saying, oh, my doll is actually helping me to improve my relationship with my human companion, with my real woman, so to speak, because it can leave the pressure of sex away, it can lift the pressure away, or it can sort of allow me to live up my fantasies without turning into a demand for my human partner. So I was wondering, here we are talking almost about not just the couple, the man and the doll, but the triple, the man, the doll, and the woman. So there is a sense in which there is this triangulation. And do you have any insights as to how these real women, and I know it is perhaps a badly way of putting it, but it is just for the sake of understanding each other, so how these human partners of the doll owner would relate to the doll?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I actually don't know, and that's something that I'll need to follow up in the interviews. I feel a bit embarrassed to ask, but I mean, you have to do that as researchers, don't you? But how does your partner feel about your doll? You know, do they have a problem with you having a sexual relationship with the doll? I guess the point I was really trying to make was just that arguments about sex dolls tend to just be so simplistic that they're just sexual outlets. But even when we kind of dig deeper into the notion of a sexual outlet, we hear from the men who own these dolls that it's more complicated than that. That, you know, in some respects, the sex doll is enhancing their human relationship. In other respects, it's taking the pressure off a human relationship. So, yeah, I mean, to what extent sex dolls are then brought, I guess, from the bedroom into the relationship in a domestic sense, I'm really not too sure. But it would be really interesting to find out how, you know, how their female partners feel about that. And indeed, what role the sex doll plays just in everyday life. You know, we know. I remember having this conversation with Kate about Sergi Santos, and he was a sex robot developer, and I think he's no longer working on sex robots anymore. Is that right, Kate?
Yeah, he stopped after there was a lot of media backlash about an incident where his doll, his proto-sex robot, was damaged at a trade show, and the media spun it as being a molestation, which was not, according to Sergi, what happened at all. And I'm inclined to take his side on this, but yeah, he's decided to put the sex robot development on hold.
Yeah, right. I just remember, I think he was on UK TV with Samantha from memory, the prototype sex robot, if you like, and he was there with his female partner as well. And they were talking about, in a very normal way, how Samantha's incorporated into their everyday life. She's part of their sex life. And I remember there was a lot of viewer backlash about that particular episode, and it's interesting that that really makes people feel uncomfortable. The fact that the sex robot might be either incorporated into the sexual relationship with the human partner, or taken out of the bedroom and just incorporated into everyday life, into family life, into sitting on the couch with the kids and talking to the kids.
Yeah, so Matt McMullen has said that he has Harmony at home and the kids can talk to Harmony. And then I when I was interviewing some sex doll owners for the work that Chloe, a PhD student, and I were doing, one of them talked about how he had a doll that he used to keep sort of in a cupboard, and he said it was a relief when his daughter started asking questions about why he owned all these wigs, and he explained that he really was invested in these dolls, and that it gave him a sense of purpose. And he says they struggled a bit at first, but which was understandable, but they saw the improvement in my mood and that I was enjoying what I was doing, and came to an understanding which they were cool with things as long as she wasn't downstairs when they were there. And then he follows up with, things have moved on since then. They're more accepting of my hobby, and I'm allowed to have a half a dozen downstairs, and I'm now completely open about what I do. And I don't have a partner at the moment, but I'd love to meet a woman who shares this passion, and there are quite a few of them out there. So I think that there's definitely this wanting it to be part of everyday life, but just meeting, because of this sex label, it's just seen as being incredibly taboo because you're corrupting your children, even though that the sex is not even the main part of this. So yeah, it's such an interesting area, and I would also love to hear more about what people who live with the partner who lives with sex dolls feel.
Perhaps it's not easy methodologically, but it would be interesting to interview these women. According to some psychoanalytic theories, and I have in my mind Lacan because I work a bit with psychoanalysis, for women, and to be a woman also means to always have this idea of the other woman. And I think this is also very much implemented in the way that popular media and culture works. What is the body of the other woman? Who is the other woman? So I guess it's interesting to see what happens when the other woman becomes a doll. Perhaps it is more honest somehow, but it is just improvised wild talk. But when we project on the other woman, the lover of our man, and of course now I know that I am using a heterosexual framework. I'm moving within an heterosexual framework. But there is a sense in which there is the other woman. And also in a women's friendship, this is very evident. And I think it is very visible. You can think of My Brilliant Friend of Elena Ferrante, the story of these two very different girls and then women that grows up together, and they are the other for each other somehow. They are the other woman. Which is always somehow a sort of a bidimensional image and the projection. So a doll in this sense is perhaps more honest.
Yeah, in some ways you can sort of relate it to a poly relationship, I guess, in that there is transparency about what is happening, and I think that you see that reflected in other things as well in sci-fi, like in Her, where Theodore finds out that Samantha, the AI, has been talking to many other people, and he's really shocked because he thinks he has the special relationship. And I wonder then, if you have this other figure, it becomes more like a relationship, an ethically non-monogamous relationship, in that you're aware of the other person and there are boundaries in place, and you have this transparency about it. And I think that that's another step for people to get their head around, because first there's the sex with the doll, and then there's the sex with the doll. The doll is another person in the relationship, and for some people that's just another step, another hurdle of taboo to overcome.
That ending always bothered me of Her, because it really tapped into this, the Madonna and the whore, that she became.
Totally. Yeah. I find that really problematic film, that every woman in that film is framed in their context and relationship to the main male character. I find it quite creepy. I mean, possibly because it's it's so near future that it's just but I did find it quite a creepy film in a way. So yeah, but yeah, I agree with you. It's like you can't win if you're the woman. You can't win. But I wanted to coming back very quickly to what Trudy and was saying about the bodies from an art perspective. I mean, this is one of the reasons I think maybe we can move away from this idea of a realistically human sex robot. And, you know, what is to stop us with the technology we have creating a sex robot that is just a giant mattress of breasts, or, you know, a cylinder full of penises, or, you know, I don't know, you can, whatever you want, you know, maybe a screen for a face so you can flash up there, or no face, or something that just narrates erotica to you. I mean, we don't have to be stuck in this super realistic thing, and we can get that sense of companionship from other means, as we can see with the disembodied idea. So perhaps the thinking of it, there's either something intrinsic in the female form in that reductive way that is at a base level appealing, or maybe we just haven't tried enough alternatives. And I'm kind of interested in what happens if I have a sex duvet that will, you know, caress me and vibrate and whatever, you know, take your pick. You know, perhaps it has feathers, perhaps it has tentacles. I don't know. Your mileage may vary.
We have one last question from Chloe, and then we wrap up.
Hi, Chloe. That's my PhD student. She's awesome and she's doing really cool work.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet everyone. I just have a quick question. I've been thinking a lot about, I've been listening attentively, and thanks, Kate, and thanks, Belinda, for some really great food for thought. What I wanted to ask is, we've talked a lot about the doll community and the kind of homosocial relations, especially you, Belinda, in your work. That's what you talk about. And I wonder to what extent you guys have any ideas about what that might look like in the future with robotic developments. You know, I think that we've talked about the doll community being quite niche, or maybe niche isn't the right word, but it's quite like a, yeah, there is the homosocial bonds within the men, within the group of men who have that relationship is really strong. But will that change, do you think, with digital developments? Will the fact that we're no longer talking about silicone dolls and instead it being apps, will that make it a wider community? Will that make it a different community? Will it make it, do you have any thoughts about what that might mean in terms of this group? Because I think that when I was doing my master's research, I was looking at interactions of, similar to your work, Belinda, but not looking at people talking about their dolls so much as how they felt about the app initially. So on that basis, I'm wondering what we might think of what mutations there might be in the future, basically.
I think that's such a good question, and I'm stumped. I don't know, I wonder, is it a tribal thing in the same way that people will identify and have we all have our tribes that we feel we belong to? Will it be an identity, like Belinda and Trudy were talking about, that it becomes part of a sexual identity? Or will it be in the same way that we are fans of a particular band, or, you know, live a particular lifestyle? Yeah, I don't know it'll be a really interesting thing to look at. What are the comparable communities that have undergone that transformation, and how have they adapted? I'm trying to think of ones that would be similar. I guess things like mothering, something like maybe like a forum like Mumsnet that started off really small and suddenly this kind of millions of users. Yeah, I'd be really intrigued to find out more about that. Another project.
That's such a great question, Chloe. I actually don't know how to answer that either. I mean, I thought it was really interesting when I was asking the exceptions of sex robot technology. Some were excited, and interestingly, they were worried that the personality they would challenge the personality that they've imagined or built in their sex doll. And I found that really interesting, and that it would change the backstory that they'd created for the sex doll, that it would change the narrative that they'd constructed around meeting their sex doll. And And a lot of them just don't want any part of the sex robot technology. So I wonder whether within the sex doll community, there are going to be sex robot enthusiasts, and there are others who are going to say, well, I don't want any part of it because it might challenge this very strong bond or this relationship that I've built up with my sex doll.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you both.
And Chloe, you are working on these topics. How would you answer your own question?
I mean, the reason I asked the question is because I haven't really come up with a satisfying answer myself yet. But I think that I agree with Belinda. I think that what I can deduce with my kind of initial research is that if you have a digital interface, there are parameters that contain what you can do. You know, you can only do so much with a technology that's designed for a certain thing. So I think that one of the things that's great about the doll community is there is this element of creativity, of flexibility. You can see it as an imposing of a narrative or an identity from a human agent into a non-human object. But what it is very creative. You can have, like, there's such a wide array of things that you can have within that format. But then because I've downloaded the Real Doll X app and I'm talking to it as well, and there's only so much you can do. There's only so much conversation you can have or responses that you can get. And I can imagine that being quite frustrating. If you want a rich relationship, one that's based on companionship, you would probably find that to be quite limiting, I think. So I'm wondering how that will kind of have a ripple effect within the community if you have this kind of backstory that you can share with people. And then I know that dolls have friendships that are created by their owners. I don't see that translating as well within the application, but then I also don't know what it would look like. So I was curious to see what other people might imagine it to be, but I don't think it will be the same. I don't think it will have this kind of rich message board sharing of images kind of thing, but I don't know what it will look like, but perhaps it will surprise me.
Yeah, it does seem like there'd be a separate strand so that the people who are living with dolls every day, that's something that will not be easily replaced by an app. So the app is perhaps a sideshow of sorts. I agree. It's really interesting.
Yeah,
can I just jump in there for 1 second? I think it's a really interesting question. Is, in a sense, what's being developed in affective computing, of course, is providing a much richer communication program. And you know, if you're a user who starts with a sex doll, but the sex doll's AI is too limited and doesn't convey, for example, affection, or that is sort of more or less of a sexualized experience, more of a companionship plus sex experience. If you could combine that with something like Ellie or the other affective robots, which are non-humanoid, you would be able to merge. You'd be able to project a quite an interesting relationship potentially using both together.
Yeah,
because they're all on different platforms, and with those who make affective computing, of course, don't want to be associated with, I suppose, the sex doll market. And the sex doll market is not interested in developing the expensive AI that would work for human communication of companionship. But somebody's going to solve those at an industrial level, I guess.
Let's see, I think we lay the ground for a lot of further strands of research, and also I hope that some tech engineer will somehow listen to us and kind of how can I say respond to all the calls that have emerged. And I think it's interesting also what Chloe said about companionship. What kind of companionship you can have with an AI or a sex doll, and how is companionship redefined by the fact that it plays out with a non-human partner, whether an AI and or a sex or a doll. And I guess the same question perhaps applies to sex. And I guess, of course, these are ongoing questions. So we are fashionably late, 20 minutes. I'm satisfied with this degree of lateness. I think it makes us glam enough, but still not yet with the Zoom fatigue. So thank you very much for participating. And of course, thank you, Kate. Thank you, Belinda, but also Thank you to Trudy and Alfred and Chloe. I hope to see you all soon, very soon. And thank you to Nate that was in the back making sure that the technology worked, and is the director of the Center for Digital Inquiry at Warwick that hosts this Summer of Law series. Next week, we are talking about the politics of dating apps and digital intimacy in UK and China, with Li Sam Chan from the Chinese University of Hong Kong and Jamie Ahim from King's College. And then we'll have a talk on the dating divide, about race, ethnicity, and dating apps. And then there's something about sexy algorithms. And then in September, we have Dominic Beckman talking about post-human error. So I hope to see some of you in our next sessions, perhaps next week. I think it's the 9th, but I'm very bad with numbers, talking about smartphone love. So yes, I'm already missing you all, but I wish you a nice day, and take care, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.